Now that we've completed all of the lectures from chapters 3 and 4, let's do some practice with supply and demand modeling. So, we're going to have a series of questions where we consider the market for tea that you drink. Could be hot, could be cold, doesn't really matter. And so I'll describe a change, and you want to identify how demand changes, if it changes, how supply changes, if it changes, how the equilibrium price changes, and how the equilibrium quantity changes. So again, if we only have one change happening and it's not a change in expectations, the first step is to figure out which one of these curves is shifting and in which direction. And with one change, we should only have one shift. Once we've identified the shift, then we look at how does that affect the equilibrium price and quantity. So we always want to follow this two-step process. So the first one, new research, tea causes cancer. So we want to think about, does this shift supply or demand and in what direction, and how does that change equilibrium price and quantity? On each of these I'll pause for about 10 seconds. Feel free to pause the video if you want more time to think through it. So this research suggesting that tea causes cancer would likely cause some people to decide they don't want to drink as much tea regardless of the price, and so that would cause demand to decrease. The decrease in demand is going to cause there to be a surplus if the price doesn't change, and so that's going to put downward pressure on the price. So the price adjusts downward to the new equilibrium, and we see a lower equilibrium quantity. So equilibrium price here is falling, and our equilibrium quantity also falling. One other thing I wanted to mention, some students have told me in the past, well, if sellers find out that their product is causing cancer, why wouldn't they want to exit the market? Well, that's presuming that our sellers have a social conscience. So that could happen in the real world, but we also know that tobacco companies exist even though they sell products that cause cancer. So when we think about this, we're going to focus primarily on the market forces for now. And so we do see that there's a reduction in quantity. Why is there a reduction in quantity? Well, that's because of the price falling. At the lower price, that induces sellers to offer less for sale. Not because they have a social conscience and are worried about the fact that their product might be dangerous, but they're responding to the change in price. Now, if they did have a social conscience and decide to shut down because of this, that could also affect the supply curve. But for now, when we think about supply and demand, we're going to focus on the market responses, not these other type of social responses. Next one. Some new technology reduces the cost of producing tea. So we have a cost-saving technology here. So this cost-saving technology is going to make it cheaper to produce the tea or to do whatever is done to treat the tea and package it and all of that, and that's going to allow for higher profits per unit, which causes the supply curve to increase or shift to the right. So if the price didn't change, we would now see a surplus, and that surplus is going to put downward pressure on the price. So the price adjusts downward to the new equilibrium, so we have a decrease in supply, causing the equilibrium price to fall. And at the lower price, we also see that we have a higher equilibrium quantity. So the equilibrium quantity is higher than where we started. And again, yes, we are buying more product. We're buying more product because of the reduced price, meaning we're moving along this demand curve. We're not shifting it. Next one, coffee prices rise, and I'm going to presume here that tea and coffee are substitute products. So, if coffee prices go up, and tea and coffee are substitute goods, when coffee becomes more expensive, people buy less coffee, moving along that demand curve. But if they're buying less coffee, they might buy more of the substitute goods like tea. And so we're focusing on the market for tea here. The demand for tea would increase or shift to the right. If the price didn't change, we would now have a shortage, and that's going to put upward pressure on the price. So the demand here is decreasing. The price increases toward the new equilibrium and results in a higher equilibrium quantity than where we started. So the equilibrium price is rising and the equilibrium quantity also rising. One thing I should mention, I don't expect you to ever, I'm not going to have questions that say, tea and coffee, are they substitutes or complements? Because that ultimately depends on your preferences, and often it's obvious, but sometimes we have students from different parts of the country or international students that might relate goods differently than the standard way we would in Wisconsin. I saw this when I lived in Chicago. I would go out to eat at the hot dog type stands, and I usually got either an Italian beef or an Italian sausage. And so I would think of those two products as being substitute goods. But you could also buy an Italian combo, which was a huge Italian beef sandwich with an Italian sausage on top. Heart attack on a plate. I don't know how anybody could finish it, but for people that bought that, they were treating the goods as complements rather than substitutes. So I'm not going to test, how goods fit together, but I am going to be testing your logic. Can you work through the questions and such? Next one, worker wages increase in the tea plants. So the worker wages are increased for whatever reason. It might be because of union contracts. It might be because of economic situations where there's a shortage of workers, whatever it might be. But we see the worker wages increasing, and so that's an increased cost of production. We're going to have an increase in the average cost to produce the product, and when our average costs are rising, that's going to cause supply to decrease because of the reduced profitability. So, as the supply curve decreases, if the price didn't change, now we have a shortage. That shortage is going to put upward pressure on the price, and we see a resulting decrease in the equilibrium quantity. So this would cause supply to decrease because of the higher wages that they're paying, and we would see that the equilibrium price is going up, and the equilibrium quantity is going down. One other comment I should make on this one. Another question I've had from students when we talk about wage increases, they say, well, if these workers have bigger wages, then shouldn't we look at this as a demand shift? Is it a normal good or an inferior good now that they have more income to spend? And that could have an impact, but we're going to try to keep things simple and look for the easy shifts. The other thing that plays in here is that a lot of us don't eat the things that we make. I spent a total of 12 years in college. I got my doctorate. I don't plan to go back to college. So if UWSP gives me a raise, the last thing I'm going to spend it on is more higher education. Similarly, I had a student one semester, I was giving this lecture, and he mentioned that he worked at Fazoli's. And he said when he started working there, he could eat, he had easy access to the garlic bread sticks, and he thought that was great. But after a while, he started figuring out, you work a long shift at Fazoli's, you go home, you get out of your car, you shower for about 45 minutes to try to get the garlic breadstick smell off of you, and then it's still in your car, and you have to smell it there. And so, he said even though he used to think they were great, he's never ever going to eat another garlic breadstick. So in any case, if we had workers that do buy the product that they help produce, that would potentially shift the demand curve. But in this case, we're going to keep to the simple shifts and presume that people don't eat what they make. Next shift, consumer incomes increase. So with this one, we have to be careful. Is tea a normal good or an inferior good? So let's start with saying, well, I'm going to suppose that tea is a normal good. So why might we think tea is normal? Well, when I think of people drinking tea, I think of the British having their high tea in the afternoon with the little mini sandwiches and the cakes and the stuff. And I think, gee, that'd be nice. So if I'm an Anglophile, perhaps I say, hey, if I had more income, then maybe I could spend more time having high tea every day. But as it is, I have to work at 4 in the afternoon, so I don't have high tea all that often. So if that's our thought process, we're treating tea essentially as a normal good. And so when we have consumer incomes increasing, people are choosing to consume more tea, demand would increase or shift to the right, and that will cause the equilibrium price and quantity to both increase. So we have an increase in the equilibrium quantity and an increase in the equilibrium price. On the other hand, we could think of tea as being an inferior good. So for me, tea is very much an inferior good. Way back when I was young, I would go to restaurants, places like Chili's and such, Hilltop Pub, and I'd order my food and they'd say, "What would you like to drink?" And if you ordered soda, you did not get free refills at that point in time at most restaurants, but if you ordered tea, you always got free refills. So I started drinking iced tea, not because I just really liked iced tea, but because I'm a cheapskate and I knew I could get the free refills with it. And if I had more income, maybe I wouldn't worry about it so much. So, if that's our thinking, then tea is an inferior good. And when we have more income, we buy less of those inferior goods, and we see that the demand here would decrease or shift to the left. The decrease in demand creates a surplus, which puts downward pressure on the price and results in a lower equilibrium quantity. So we have a decrease in demand resulting in the equilibrium price decreasing and the equilibrium quantity also decreasing. Next one, profits attract new tea farmers. So if we have new tea farmers entering the industry, that's going to cause an increase in supply because we have an increased number of sellers. So the supply curve shifts to the left. That results in a surplus if the price doesn't change, and so that surplus puts downward pressure on the price. And we result with a higher equilibrium quantity than where we started. So we have an increase in supply, causing the equilibrium price to fall and the equilibrium quantity to rise. Finally, sugar prices rise. So I'm going to presume here that tea and sugar are complements, things that we use in combination. And I do like sweet tea. I usually put sugar in my tea, whether it's hot or iced or whatever. So if sugar prices go up, people naturally buy less sugar. We're moving along the demand curve for sugar there. And if I can't afford as much sugar, maybe I choose not to drink as much tea. And so the sugar prices rising could cause a decrease in the demand for its complements like tea. And we're modeling here the tea market, not the sugar market. So demand decreases. That creates a surplus at the pre-existing price, which puts downward pressure on the price as we adjust to the new equilibrium, which has a lower equilibrium quantity. So we have a decrease in demand, and that causes the equilibrium price to go down, and it also causes the equilibrium quantity to go down. So that's the last example I had to work with, and this gives us a nice variety of shift factors changing and how supply and demand would shift. One thing to keep in mind, when we look at the demand shifts, they're always very simple. So if we have a decrease in demand, the price and quantity both end up falling. If we have an increase in demand, the price and quantity both end up rising. When we have supply shifts, price and quantity get moved in opposite directions. But the supply change is always consistent with the quantity change. So if supply is increasing, the equilibrium quantity is rising, and the equilibrium price is moving in the opposite direction. But if supply is decreasing or shifting to the left, then the equilibrium quantity will fall, equilibrium price will rise, moving in the opposite direction. So I think it's always best to draw the graphs, but this kind of gives us an easy way to check ourselves. The demand, we get consistent changes in all three that we're looking at. With supply change, we get a consistent response in terms of increased supply causing increased equilibrium quantity, decreased supply causing decreased equilibrium quantity, and then the prices are always moving in the opposite direction. So that wraps up our practice problems. Our next set of lectures and exercises look at Chapter 5, focusing on elasticity.